Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be doing a tier list for the Obsidian Flames format. We have the first set of regionals coming up in the next couple of weeks, and we've had a good chance to playtest with admittedly not many new decks, but a couple in there, and also are having that knee-jerk reaction to the World Championships as well. So there has been a bit of an incline and decline of a number of archetypes, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today as we start going through the top decks in the format.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to kick off with pretty much the one new deck of the set of Obsidian Flame, and that's going to be based around the brand new Charizard EX, primarily paired with Arceus and Pidgeot. I feel like people have really settled on that being the best way to play. We're going to pop that right in the middle of the B tier. I think there was massive hype around this deck to begin with, and it seemed very, very strong. It seemed like a brilliant new partner for Arceus that got around the awkward damage caps of double turbo and meant that Arceus was actually a more aggressive threat than it has been seen as for the past sort of year or so. It also had the brand new Pidgeot EX, which a lot of people sort of were very reminiscent about from the older Pidgeot, but also the brilliant sort of searching capabilities of that, and how that and the V-Star power of Arceus Starbirth all sort of fit in this really neat package to be able to have quite a consistent engine going forward, to be able to do some then really powerful things with Charizard, which was sort of the mid to late game attacker, which is just an absurdly statted Pokemon card. It's got a huge amount of HP. It can reach one shots in the mid to late game, and also pretty much set up checkmate boards, and it only gives up 2 prizes on a card that I think typically has the stats of like a 3 prize card. So it all seemed to be going really, really well, and it was by far one of the because it was kind of the only massive new archetype. It was the one that was most talked about. But on the first couple of days of ladder, it was everywhere, primarily because it was free, but also because it seemed really, really good. But we've already started to see a massive decline in play of Charizard, and I think the biggest issue with it is the fact that it is so ability reliant. That Path is just an absolute killer for it. Now, Path has existed in the format, for nearly well over 2 years now, and it sort of comes in waves, goes up and down as to how popular Path is. But right now, we have a lot of decks that are very weak to Path. Things like Gardevoir, one of the best plans for some decks is just Roxanne Path late game and trying to completely shut the deck down. We have lots of decks that are dedicated to just playing with Path, things like Arctina, New Age Miraidon, and stuff like that. But even some of these decks that haven't been able to play Path, like Losso and Giratina, now can with other inclusions from Paldea Evolved. And because of that, I think the amount of Path in the format is just way too high for this to really creep much higher than the B tier. There's certain things you can try, things like higher stadium counts, lost vacuums, all of this kind of stuff, even the new Solrock and Lunatone. But everything we found with Charizard, you have to sacrifice something to be able to deal with Path. And even then, when we come to talk about Losso and Giratina, which I think we argued was one of the best decks, if not the best deck in Paldea Evolved, and spoiler alert, nothing has really changed. Even if we're able to deal with all of the Path shenanigans in this way, that way, and whatever, you still have, I think, a pretty unfavorable matchup to the best deck in format. Now, again, admittedly, it's a bit skewed here and there because of awkward lists and things like that in early data. But me and Joe have quite intensively played this matchup in a couple of different ways, both from the Charizard perspective and the Tina perspective, because we both really enjoyed Tina. So the first thing we wanted to do was to see how the brand new decks fared up with it. And it felt pretty convincing for Tina. There wasn't much that Charizard could do. So it's sort of stuck in this middle tier. It's really weird because I think, as I mentioned, Charizard as a card is absurdly statted. In a vacuum, it's incredibly powerful. It has inbuilt acceleration, an insanely efficient attack cost that just gets better over time. And it's just in this really awkward spot where there's a couple of awkward things going for it. Even things down to only having 60 HP Charmanders and stuff actually just is such an issue in the mid to late game against these Lost Zone decks. So at the moment, there's still some hills to climb with Charizard. it's likely that it's still maybe going to be more popular than some of these other B tier decks just because it is Charizard. And it like when you're able to dodge and weave some of these path decks, it actually feels very, very strong. But right now the format just doesn't look quite right for it. There's a couple of upgrades the deck gets in 151, which I think is very relevant. But right now it feels unfortunately a little bit mid tier, which is I think not really what a lot of people were necessarily expecting because it came out of the gates seemingly swinging quite strong. But yeah, I think it's fallen to that mid tier for now.
Yeah, and that's not to say that like lists can't improve, because I think that definitely can be the case. Definitely from what we're seeing in the online spaces, I think there's easy ways to grow and make Charizard better and improve on its pretty abysmal online win rate right now. And it does have reasons to be played, but as we're saying, the initial format that we're expecting for the first couple of regionals, it looks pretty rough for Zard. Let's put Lost Tina back in that top spot, the same place we had it for the World Championships. And that's really just because it can take on pretty much anything in the room, just due to its versatility, due to its disruption in the late game. You can recover from slowish starts and still have a decent time in the game. It was hype for Worlds, it was popular at Worlds, but it also performed at the World Championships. And I think we're at that point now with Giratina where, outside of having some preference changes, we're around that sort of 57 card range with Lost Tina at this stage. So everyone's going to be playing very well refined, very consistent builds of Tina. And this just has fight into everything, because you have your versatility of attackers, you have your high damage output threats for the matchups where it's relevant, and you have Path at your disposal, you have Hand Disruption, you just cover all your bases with this archetype. So I still feel like there's not really any deck in the room that you're too afraid of facing, even your lower win rate matchups like against Turbo Lost Box or against Urshifu, Intel, etc. They're like 45 percenters. So I think this is just one of the best decks in the room you can be playing still, and I think that's going to be most likely like the safe choice in air quotes, or one of the more popular decks. I'd be amazed if this wasn't in the sort of top 3 of popularity in the first couple of regionals. So also an archetype you definitely have to have in your consideration and have playtesting against. But don't expect to have like a really high win rate or punish Giratina Lost Box. There aren't many like counter decks truly out there, just because of the nature of the archetype and that it has its Hand Disruption comeback potential, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Like you say, I think it's sort of gone head and shoulders above other archetypes in that A tier now. Looking at A, let's kick things off with the other main Lost Zone deck, Lost Zone Box, which sort of we we go from splitting up Lost Zone boxes, then combining them based on sort of how popular different variants are. It very much feels like we're now down to just Turbo Lost Box, but I think Kyogre is starting to creep back in the format. There was a couple of really well finishing Kyogres in the World Championships, and Kyogre's sort of always had this undercurrent over the past couple of weeks of it's another great time for Kyogre. So this kind of combines both of those because I think both are pretty viable, and I think a lot of the time you actually see some of these lists end up being blended together, and they somehow do fit some of the turbo stuff with like an extra energy recycler and a Kyogre and stuff like that. So this kind of combines all of them into one, and yeah, it's going to sit in that A tier. I think the limiting factors compared to Tina are I still think it's a little bit harder to play. There's a lot more resource board. There's a lot of resource management. Tina also does have a lot of resource management, but it feels just a little bit more with the Turbo Lost Box. And I also think it doesn't perform as well into Hand Disruption, whereas Tina can sort of set up checkmates with a couple of Tinas. The Lost Zone Box does sometimes have to keep doing combos for like 2 or 3 turns, which is where things like Roxanne can sort of trip you up. But it still feels like a very, very powerful deck. There's still plenty of other one prize decks that you get to be the Sableye deck in and try and win that way. But you also have things like Dragonite to really try and push some of these 2 prize archetypes out of the way quite quickly. Arceus is evidently still around, so whilst there's still Arceus variants around, Dragonite's going to be a really, really nice pickup for early game pressure against decks like those. Similarly with I guess things like Mew and stuff, you're able to try and take some early prizes here and there. I think this will still be also one of the top 3 decks. It's or most popular decks. I still think it's probably at the top of tier A, and I do think you have, at least from my testing, you are sort of pretty happy going into Giratina. Again, it doesn't feel particularly favored for either side. I think Giratina's best bet is just trying to disrupt you in the late game, and trying to run away with the game with a couple of Sableyes of their own. But it does very much feel like a turbo lost box that has a very, very good start, can often steal the game before Tina can even sort of get going, which is really, really important, I think, like we say, going forward. Still expect things like Gardevoir to be really popular as well. So you're always going to be happy to see those. And yeah, I think it's still one of these, slightly higher skill ceiling decks. But again, it feels like whilst the meta keeps changing and Lost Box is one of these decks that always will adapt to it because it's kind of like a toolboxy style deck with what attackers it plays, it does feel like we're honed in on a solid 90 to 95% of the list now. So I still think you're going to get your experienced players that are just going to be tearing up tournaments with this. And yeah, it's not really, it's kind of, it looked like Charizard might be a little bit of an issue just because of how big Charizard could be, but even like the data has shown that Lost Box is pretty fine into Charizard. You've still got things like the Dragonite and stuff for that early pressure if they're going down the Arceus route. And at the end of the day, in at least the English meta or the Western meta, they only have 60 HP Charmanders. So going sort of full throttle trying to get to Sableye can just stop them from even getting a Charizard out ever. So yeah, it doesn't actually seem as bad as it may have looked given Charizard's stats, which again kind of means that there's no reason to not be playing Lost Box necessarily.
Good points. The one thing I did want to talk about is the sort of punisher of Lost Box is going to be Inteleon Urshifu, the Rapid Strike toolbox. I do think this boasts still a decent number of really good scalps in that you punish arc builds in the format and you punish the Lost Zone engine, which is still fantastic for you. We're going to unfortunately still keep this down in that B tier because at the end of the day, you are still having to dodge some matchups. You're actually not that great into Charizard. I think if you go first, you're pretty okay into the matchup because you can sometimes set up Yoga Loops as early as turn 2 against them because they have so much 60 hit pointers around on the board. But you are dodging Fusion Mew and you are dodging Lugia. And if Charizard's only this like 8th to 10th best deck in the room, for example, Fusion Mew, spoilers, is still going to be great in this format and still going to be a very powerful archetype. So Intel still has to keep its head down, still has to dodge and weave a couple big matchups. We saw at the World Championships that Alex Shemansky was playing the Spiritomb plus Giacomo combination in the deck to improve the Mew matchup. But I still feel like that's a better sort of thing in concept than actually being worth the deck space a lot of the time for what is already like quite a bad matchup and you're already quite a combo based archetype. So could be that you just take those L's and try and run the gauntlet and pick your moment for Intel Urshi. It's going to be one of those sorts of decks, I think, in this format where it's not going to be safe for every tournament that you go into, but knowing that a lot of the room will be Comfey based and Arc based, you're still going to get a lot of free wins, and that's still the benefit of this archetype. And you actually low-key enjoy the uptick in Miraidon that we've seen post-Worlds as well, that we'll talk about in a moment. So it could be that from the get-go, this is a good meta call, but there's always that looming fear of how much Lugia and how much Mew will show up. For example, day 1 of Worlds, I would never have expected Lugia to be the most played archetype, and that just means that you have to really trust your metagaming if you're going to play the Rapid Strike box these days.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of Mew, let's stick it back in that A tier. Obviously, it's just won the World Championships, and in a meta which only really introduces one new deck, you just have to take a look at how it performs into said deck. And again, whilst Charizard may seem like a pretty bad matchup because it's a massive 2-prize Pokemon that's also a dark type, so has no worries with dealing with Mews, turns out the pressure from Meloetta is still completely fine and can still push them out of the game. You're still able to, use all of your power tablets at once to try and go for big combos against Charizard. You're also able to quite happily leap into them and set them up because they don't really have any healing or anything like that. So you're able to leap into them, feed them a 2-prizer, and then try and win that way. They still have plenty of other 2-prizers like the Pidgeot and the Arceus as well, that you're able to, you can even start maybe find ways to play a Horn and stuff again if you're really worried to be able to just try and double dip on the Arceus. So whilst it's probably not a particularly good matchup, there are definitely avenues you can take. And again, the sort of the downwards trend of Charizard already in the meta, as Joe mentions, means that realistically, if you're taking on Charizard as a bad matchup and you're still pretty happy with where Mew is at in the format for Worlds, realistically, it might be a little bit worse than it was. Maybe you're now looking at an extra 5% bad matchups in the room, but it's still going to be pretty strong. Obviously, Fusion Mew always, or Mew in general, always has to think about how much Spiritomb and Drapion is going to be played, and that will always be sort of the tango that you have to play with Mew. There's plenty of decks that can very easily throw in a Spiritomb. There's still plenty of decks that will happily play a Drapion just to secure the matchup that way. So it's always going to have a bit of a target on its head and have plenty of these random one-card counters that people might try out. But again, it still feels really consistent. It still draws more cards than pretty much any deck in format. And I think realistically, again, if Charizard is only going to be sort of a 4 to 5% meta share in these tournaments, the meta isn't actually that different for Mew compared to what it was in the Worlds format, and it did incredibly well at Worlds. So I think there's still many reasons to be playing Mew. Still draws a boatload of cards, like I say, which often is just the heart and soul of how to win games in Pokemon. So yeah, still feels A tier. Maybe has a little bit more to worry about than say a month ago, but not too much overall, I don't think.
Very true. Let's start bashing out some of these path decks, I guess. And I think the new one on the block is kind of most interesting to me right now. The online stats from Maridon Flaffy are really, really promising. And this new age build that we've had gifted to us from Mahone, from the World Championships with their top 32 placement, is a very high profile result, I think is fair to say. And just by being a popular streamer, etc., a lot of people have taken note and started to test Maridon Flaffy themselves. And it turns out that just adding in Quad Path, a number of Judge and Iono, gives this deck a whole new win condition, a whole new outlook. It's not just going to be that aggressive punch-up deck. It's going to have that aggressive punch-up approach, but also every now and then you buy a free turn because you've cheesed the opponent out of a decent enough hand where they can respond on you altogether because you've dropped an early turn 1 path after you've done your Maridon EX abilities and got a full board of lightning stuff on your own end. And just the fact that this can be a deck that puts turn 1 path down is so powerful and so detrimental to so many archetypes that it becomes this whole new threat in the game. I think it challenges the sort of pure Palkia deck that we've been seeing popping up more recently. It can be a challenge to Arceus decks as well, just because that high 220 hit points on an EX rather than a V is so frustrating for Arc players, and because, you know, previously Arctinas haven't been playing Pumpkaboo anywhere around their own path to the peak, so you getting that early path jammed before they get a V-Star is just so powerful against them. So I think it's a solid enough archetype. We can't put it much higher because it still is rolling those dice of trying to get the judge path rolling and make sure that you actually get out of it your own end sometimes as well, which is never the easiest thing. Also, you are relying on those generators, and you are still a little bit weak into Lost Zone box at the very least, and from at least the matchups from the gang playing it at Worlds, seems like they're fairly weak into Mew as well without tech inclusions, so that could certainly be a consideration card for Maridon Flaffy going into the next set of regionals, just based on anecdotal evidence that the Mew matchup's not great from the sort of Maridon players at Worlds. So those are the things to consider for the archetype, and you still also have to worry about a few matchups like that Intel Urshi knocking around and stuff like that, so it's not necessarily like a flawless deck, but adding in those paths definitely gives it that extra dimension and asks more questions of the general format, I would say.
Definitely. The other big path deck, I guess, is Arctina. That was the sort of pre-Worlds big path deck, and we still do think this is the slightly better path deck overall. We're going to put this at the bottom of the A tier. I think realistically, your biggest worry is Lost Zone Giratina. It's a pretty bad matchup for you because they're the more aggressive Tina build, and you really have to try and shut them out with Path and Judge and that kind of stuff. But with the natural uptick in path counts in Giratina, they can sometimes path you before you can path them, and that basically, again, shuts the whole deck down as current lists go. So there might have to be some consideration into maybe a counter stadium or a Pumpkaboo or anything like that, but all of these feel really hard to find as one-ofs in your Arctina deck because of the awkward ball search we have and things like that. So I think that's the biggest issue right now, is that the natural uptick in path in other decks can sometimes invalidate your own strategy, which is kind of funny. But there will always be these decks that, like we say, try and shut down shut down other decks just by spamming lots of hand disruption and path and just being a little bit bigger than and out of range compared to other decks. And it still feels like Tina can definitely do that. Tina still feels like a massive beneficial, well, a massive Pokemon in this format, and benefits from all of these other sort of bigger Pokemon coming out, because it always has huge damage output that often, is enough to at least get them into two-shot range and still ask a lot of questions of people, which is really important. I think the big trend at the moment is playing Leafeon in the deck as well, which can help with things like Charizard, but also gets over the massive issue that everyone always, or the massive point that everyone always has with Arceus, is that the most important points about Arceus decks are turn 1 Arceus energy attachment. Leafeon basically turns all of your ball search into an additional energy out, which is really, really nice as well, as serving an additional purpose in not being a terrible attacker into the Charizard matchup and hitting them for weakness as well. So that's kind of the trend that the deck is going in. I'm pretty sure Joe and I are fairly sort of set on the conclusion that Leafeon is the best partner, the best grass type partner for Arceus. To be honest, there's a couple of others that people have tried out, things like Shaman or Serperior, but Leafeon just seems to be, in our head, sort of leagues above the rest, just because of that additional ability turn 1, which is really important. That's kind of the direction of the deck. Again, it hasn't really changed too much in a little while. You can now play things like the Vengeful Punch as well, instead of Box of Disasters, which is most of the time just an upgrade compared to Box of Disasters into Gardevoir, because you don't have to be at full HP, which is really important, and can also have some additional benefit in then being able to put things into Arceus range and stuff as well. So a couple of additions here and there, but realistically, this is going to be a very similar 60 that we've seen for the past few months, just trying to lock people out of the format, which against pretty much everything but other path decks, I actually still feel is a pretty valid strategy right now.
Let's bash out some other Arc builds. I think Arc Umbreon's in a bit of a strange spot. Because of the amount of path, I have to be a little bit concerned about an archetype that relies so heavily on exactly Starbirth, and then outside of that, just Supporter Draw. That's all the archetype has. I'm kind of interested in, similar to Arctina, the Leafeon coming into the deck list just to give you those extra energy attachments, just to get into the game for the first instance, but also gives Arceus that means of hitting 230 turn 2 if you have your turn 1 attachment that isn't a double turbo energy, as well as a Leafeon going on to an Arc if you've gone first. You're threatening that 230 turn 2, which I think is actually a big deal, and as big of a deal as actually just not whiffing your turn 1 attachment from a Leafeon. Sometimes being able to have a double coloured energy drop is massive for you, and then you're representing the type coverage into Charizard as well as having the type coverage into Mew and Gardevoir still. Umbreon's pretty strange right now, though, in that Lost City seems to be less powerful into Guardy, now that we've seen Tord bring the Mirage Step to the forefront. It seems to have safeguarded Gardevoir a little bit against, the Mew matchup and Arc Umbreon to an extent that relied on Lost City so heavily. You just seem to have less of a benefit into that Gardevoir matchup these days. But do bear in mind that Tord didn't play any out to mean look in his Gardevoir build, so if people are net decking a Tord 60... they will get once again punished by a Mean Look, Painful Spoon, Infinite combo. So that's something that could go in your favour, I suppose. I'm still very concerned about this matchup, and Lost Zone Tina probably being in the frame as the most popular archetype right now. Very, very scary for me. Even just Arc Tina being around and Miraidon Flaffy being around, these path-based decks. There's just so much of it right now, and it means that you're not going to play the game just way too much, I think. So, yeah, it's a shame. A bit of nuance to the Gardevoir matchup in that it could actually be much more favourable now, or could be worse, depending on where you frame it, and if the opponent is going to be playing, no counter card to Umbreon or whatnot. That's the only small debate I have, but I do think in general we're having to lower this archetype's potential, even just because there could be a small uptick in one-hit KO decks because of Charizard's high hit points. It might be pushing people into playing like Chien-Pao Bats Caliber that little bit more than previously, and that's another worry for this sort of tanking style archetype. So it feels like a bad time to be playing a deck like this.
Yeah, I think similarly, Arc Duraludon is actually all the way down in that D tier for us. For very similar reasons. It's another tanking style deck, but Not only that, Duraludon's big benefit, or a lot of the reason why people were drawn to Duraludon was Lugia's presence, and it even sort of led to Lugia having to play counters towards it. I now think, but there was also a lot of other decks that were special energy reliant. Now Lugia is a lot less popular than it was, and there's a lot of just basic energy decks right now, which means Duraludon is a lot of the time a pretty dead and sort of inefficient card. It still has massive HP, of course, but there's other two prize options that have the same HP as Duraludon now, and if its ability isn't really doing anything for you, there's not really much reason to play it. So yeah, I really feel like Duraludon is taking a bit of a backseat right now. I think the natural downward trend of Lugia is the biggest reason, but also there's just better Arceus partners. I feel like Charizard is just a better tanky Pokemon right now because it also has scalable damage, which is really, really important, and gives up one less prize. So yeah, there's still plenty of good Arceus partners, and Duraludon doesn't really provide anything that any of these other ones do now compared to when Lugia was way more popular in the format.
Let's talk about Lost Box Charizard. I think it's time. I really, really like this deck, and I think it's right back in the mix. We've just talked about how the Arc Umbreon and the Arcdura are in far worse positions. And these are some of the big reasons why Charizard actually kind of got bullied out as that other Lost Zone archetype. Whereas, Kyogre and Giratina were able to stick around that little bit better. Charizard really struggled with the Lost City aspect. And even though Fusion Mew is still in that mix and we're still saying it's very powerful and is likely to still be playing an amount of Lost City, because Charizard will play something in addition to Charizard to deal with exactly the Mew matchup, oftentimes it will be a Drapion or some other form of attacker, I feel like it's okay that they play Lost Cities against you because in that matchup you literally need to Charizard one time anyway. So I feel like this is kind of back, and I feel like there's a lot of reasons for this. Firstly, I've been playtesting it with some different builds. I've recently done a video on Sizzle, and I'm actually a big believer in that style of approach. The main thing that I took away from that is that I love playing Barrel in Charizard Lost Box to give you that sort of safeguard. We saw Pedro, actually, I believe it was at NEIC, played Milotic in his Lost Box Charizard, and I think Barrel does a similar thing that has kind of more fluid functionality, I guess is a better way to put it, just to give you those top-ups throughout the game. I've actually used Barrel quite early on just to help you cycle to try and get to your sort of early choruses, that sort of thing, and it could be low-key kind of massive. So yeah, I really like Lost Box Zard with Barrel coming into the deck list. I think it gives you a really good time into Giratina. I think it's really good into Gardevoir, and I think your high damage output is still enough to get you through the Miraidons, the Lugias, the Arceus decks, that sort of thing. So I'm massively a believer of Lost Zard. I think Sizzle could be a way to play it. I think Luxray Reversal is a combination that is also interesting to me right now to give you that early burst of 180 damage with also that lightning type coverage to help out against specifically Lugia, where we know that regular Lost Boxes have struggled with Lugia in the past and have been forced to play multi-prize decks. I think Charizard can be a Puritan single-prize archetype that is really worthwhile in the mix right now, and I think has the space to play vacuums and sort of race to 10 for pure Lost Box mirror match situations, that sort of thing. Yes, there's that headache of you're always having to maintain mana fee and the opponent doesn't have to in the mirror and stuff, but I don't think that's the be-all and end-all of the matchup, and I think especially if you're safeguarding yourself around hand disruption, yes, a Sableye can come down and deal with a Barrel all in one turn, but then they're not getting their excess damage counters that they often need in the matchup where you'll be doing it to them the entire time. So just in terms of a pure prize race, the Barrel is also giving you a nice safeguard. So yeah, I think there's so many reasons why I like Lost Zard right now. It's probably my top choice if I was going to be playing in one of these opening regionals. And yeah, I'm a massive believer of the archetype. I think it's going to be back in a big way.
Exciting, because I also love the archetype. So yeah, that's music to my ears. Let's take a look at Gardevoir. I think we also haven't really touched on this one so far. Still in that A tier for sure. Still feels very, very strong. I still think it's one of the. I still think it's the deck with maybe still the highest sort of power level ceiling. It does absurd things and it's super crazy. It draws a load of cards. It can be a completely sort of Puritan one prize deck if it wants to be, other than the Gardevoir. And it turns out Charizard may not be as popular as first thought, so it's not the end of the world that it's gaining what's not necessarily a good matchup, because you're able to. It turns out it's not going to quite be as popular as before. I still think all of the Lost Zone decks above it are concerning. Lost Zone has kind of always been the thorn in Gardevoir's side, but again, natural inclusions like second reversal energy and Mirage Gate from Tord mean that these decks, these bad matchups are mitigated somewhat. They're still going to be awkward here and there, but I think things like that are naturally always going to make the matchup a little bit more favorable for you. Just, not having to damage your single prize Guardies and stuff and make them a little bit more difficult for Lost Zone decks to get through is really important. I still think you're, again, pretty much fine into many of the other decks in format as well. Again, it really feels like if Charizard isn't going to be anywhere near as popular as first expected, there's way less to worry about as Gardevoir as well. I think the only thing to keep in mind is, as I've already mentioned, there are way more decks now that can play sort of mini Box of Disasters in this Vengeful Punch, which you just need to kind of keep your wits about you. But even things like Lost Vacuum we've seen in Gardevoir lists, so it's not like this is counterable. We can definitely deal with that. If people are just going to be net decking towards this, they're going to have an inbuilt plan anyway. So just a couple of things to note, I guess. Really, it still feels like Gardevoir is super strong, and I still really like Tord's build. I still like double reversal. I think it's really, really important. I think Mirage Gate is also very key to, again, just not losing to some of these more cheesy strategies like Lost City and stuff. So still feels really strong. It feels like there's not much room to explore with Gardevoir at the moment. People have kind of talked a little bit about things like the Solrock Lunatone stuff, but I think realistically keeping it as simple as possible and still just making Gardevoir do draw as many cards and just uptrade as efficiently as possible is how to win with the deck. Nothing really changes there in my eyes. So still very, very valid, and I think will still probably be in that top 3 played decks. I think it's actually quite interesting. It's going to be quite interesting seeing exactly what the top 3 decks will be, because I feel like people naturally favor or tend to be drawn away from Lost Zone decks a little bit, and that in their play rate, even when they're the top decks in format, they're never really the best or the most popular deck in the room. But I also feel like Gardevoir is not really like that at the moment anyway, either, because of how much Lost Zone is around it. So it's going to be quite interesting to see what the meta breakdown is for the first couple of regionals, because I think there's going to be a few decks that all sit around a very similar percentage and are all very close in numbers, but there's going to be no sort of head and shoulders most popular deck in these regionals. It's going to be one of these 4 or 5 that we've got at the top. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing how or where people land for the early regionals, because all of the decks, other than Gardevoir at one time, it always feels like these decks all tend to be around a similar play rate. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see.
Very true. Right, another tier list, another time that we can slag off Chembao Baxcalibur. Yet again, the data is telling us that this deck is still quite poor. I think there was a small upheaval in the first week where Charizard was doing well. People were jumping on the Chempao bandwagon as yet another archetype that can target Charizard quite nicely. But if Charizard's not all that, then what's the reason to be playing Chempao when it's still quite weak into the Lost Zone engines in general? It's still quite weak into the Path decks, and we've got a new one on the block with Miraidon, and even Miraidon can challenge like the Palkia part of this archetype as well. And yeah, it's still one of the less consistent archetypes, still one of the more vulnerable to hand disruption. Please, for the love of God, play Barrel in the deck, because otherwise you just lose to everyone playing an Iono against you. So yeah, it's still a tight squeeze. There's still too much kind of going on in the archetype, and it's still just one of the more high maintenance decks in the game. And that's why we're putting it in C tier, because there's still not many big selling points. It's still same old Chempao Baxcalibur that it was pre-Worlds.
The deck that I actually think is, or the water deck that I think is a little bit better is actually just the Palkia deck we have here. I still think I still feel like this is a massively unexplored archetype. Pure Palkia, I think it's been explored a little bit more now, and I think Cyrus Cyrus is this is a great starting point, but there's something in my heart of hearts tells me that there's still more with this archetype that people can do. It still feels like a really efficient attacker, which is really important. You get some of the benefits of things like chi and power, but you also have the great benefits of just being a water type and having the water engine and things like Irida and stuff, which is really, really good. And yeah, it's just sort of this tempo-y. It's less explosive than chi and power, and naturally probably struggles with some of the more one-hit matchups here and there, but feels like it can do well into a lot of the two prize or the V and V star matchups, which is important. And you've still got sort of these big swing turns where you can play things like Cross Switcher and Canceling Cologne and accelerate to a Greninja in one turn and try and close out the game quite early against some of these multi-prize, these small low HP decks, things like God of War and Charizard and stuff as well. So yeah, I really feel like this archetype is underexplored, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if Cyrus or anyone else actually takes the archetype any further in some of these early regionals. There was even very early talk of like a Palkia Charizard, which never really went anywhere, and I don't think will go anywhere. But it really feels like Palkia is something that still needs to be in the format somewhere. And yeah, Joe and I both feel it's actually better than the more combo-y Chi and Power Excalibur, because you don't have the reliance of a stage 2 or anything like that. It feels like that deck is really feast or famine, whereas Palkia is just a lot more consistent and a lot more tempo oriented, and you're able to just be a little bit less explosive, but do it a whole lot more frequently. So yeah, an archetype I'm really interested to see whether it goes anywhere. Not quite sure where that anywhere is. It will be interesting to see if there is any more exploration with it. But yeah, really feels like an interesting archetype and one that I want to see more of.
Yeah, me too. I was super prepared to put this much higher, but we also respect Miraidon's uptick, and that's also a concern. To round out our B tier, then we have Lugia, and we're putting it at the top of B tier. Still flipping those coins, still trying to get those decent openings, and having to dodge more path than ever, because we have Giratinas oftentimes playing 3 copies now. We have Miraidon playing quad. We have Arctina playing quad. Possibly even some Fusion Mews going back to like 2 copies, just to try and have a chance into Charizard, for example. So a ton of path to be having to navigate against. I think you're much less happy seeing Tina Lost Box than Lost Zone Box being that popular. Guardy playing double reversal now becomes a much more challenging matchup than it used to be. And yeah, you're still having to worry about the early tempo decks of Fusion Mew and Miraidon popping off as well. So a lot of challenges for Lugia. It's still powerful in its own right, and it can still get the job done when you have those decent hands and you're not getting crumbed immediately by Path Judge or even just Path being thrown out there in the opening stages. And genuinely, I do really like the Squawk ability that we saw at the World Championships from the highest placing list. I think that's probably a mandatory card right now, because there's still going to be Spiritombs roaming around and gives you that extra push in the opening stages before you get hit with that path to try and establish a hand. I think those are all important inclusions, but yeah, I still think it's rough out there for single strike Lugia. The one thing that might be nice is that you don't necessarily have to play Urshifu now. Urshifu VMAX can burst through Charizard, but Duraludon seems to be sort of going into insignificance and not really be worth teching for. So potentially you gain like a space. If you want to still tech for Charizard, you can play Cobalion. Otherwise, you gain 2 spaces, and that could be an extra Ball Search card and an extra Stadium or something, and that does add to your percentage points. So just a small bit of food for thought there, that you can play a cleaner 60 than possibly for the World Championships and feel a lot safer about that situation. But there's still a lot of challenges for the archetype, which means that not every game you're getting into it, and that's a bit of a concern for the deck.
Yeah. And finally, we're going to take a look at Gudra Lost Zone Box. Realistically, it's like the antithesis of Giratina. It's the tanky version, and right now there is way too much one-shot in the format. You've got Giratina, you've got Gardevoir, but you've also got sort of smaller things, or more niche things like Chi and Pao, and now Charizard as well. Charizard is able to eventually get over Gudra's healing and sort of damage reduction range as well. So Yeah, it's just not really the time for Gudra. It had a sort of flash of success in some of the Worlds format tournaments, but didn't really see any play Worlds, and we still feel like nothing has really changed from the Worlds format too much to open the way gates for Gudra right now. So yeah, not the time for Gudra in our opinion.
Right, so that wraps up our tier list. I don't think you are going to the first tournament, i.e., you're not going to
No,
Barcelona. No.
no, I'm not playing anything until Lille, but I definitely would be playing Giratina just because it's
Yeah.
basically all I've been playing. Super interested in hearing about the evolution of Charizard Lost Box, though.
Oh yeah.
Given that I have, I guess, a little bit more time than other people before regionals, maybe I will start testing with that early. And again, Palkia. Palkia for me is something that I'm not sure whether it's going to make its way much higher on this tier list. I think it probably will settle at a B tier deck, even if there is much more development with it. But I don't know, something about Palkia and the deck in general. It just feels like it's there's something in there. So yeah, they're kind of my picks at the moment. Definitely Giratina though, as what I would play if there were a regional tomorrow.
Yeah, I think I would actually lay my hats on Lost Charizard. It's just at least the most fun thing I've been playing as of late, and I still feel like there's so much more room for it to get better as the format shifts in its favor. I'm also super interested in Miraidon, if it's going to be that deck that stays in the format and is going to be like a new sort of presence, give it that new lease of life late into its life cycle, and for no real reason really, outside of it's just not been played in that direction too much, but now certainly could be. So I think that also could continue to see success just with a greater number of players piloting the archetype. So I think that's really interesting. We have a number of archetypes on here, quite a diverse and wide metagame, and we did find it quite hard ranking between A and B tier and even between the tiers themselves. So yeah, I think it's a really good time to be playing Pokemon, and that there are genuinely like 10 plus viable decks. You know, our A and B tier plus an S tier deck, that's already 11 decks that we think are all good and could win on any given day. And then even Chien-Pao Baxcalibur has a cult following, so there could be always a wave of people playing that anyway. So yeah,
Yeah.
genuinely being like 12 decks that could win on a given day of a tournament is quite scary from a metagaming perspective, but also quite healthy, and means that we aren't just facing like 3 mirror matches every day one of Swiss, which I also think is like a blessing, especially for some of how these mirror matches play out. So really am enjoying the diversity of the format, and also the adaptations that people are going to have to go for, the sort of subtle tweaks that we've had with a small uptick in path, a potential new contender in Charizard, and yeah, maybe a fall off of a couple archetypes here and there, just as a continuation from Worlds more than anything, as it feels like Obsidian Flames is still a little bit underwhelming. But I'm also interested in how Lunarok performs potentially as well, because we've mentioned so many times that the Achilles heel for many of these decks are paths, so that if we can have some functioning ability-based decks because they can play around path, that could also be another interesting space in the metagame that opens up.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's it's one of these sets which doesn't necessarily shake up the meta too much, but just refines a lot of the decks we have. And given what was revealed at Worlds and stuff, I feel like if you really are already fed up of this format because it feels too similar, it looks like Paradox Rift is going to change things massively, right? So there's not actually that many tournaments in this format, and we have 151, which again I think doesn't do loads and loads, but adds a handful of cards that are enough to at least shift things around a little bit here and there. So yeah, there is I guess change on the horizon, but yeah, I agree with you. I think it is a really good time to be playing Pokemon, and I don't agree with the rhetoric that it's not a very good format or anything right now, because I think just looking at this tier list, the fact that you can play, like you say, any of the basically 11 or 12, sorry, yeah, 12, because I do agree that in your sentiment about Baxcalibur as well, you can play 12 of these decks and realistically have a very good chance at making a day 2 and even going all the way through to top 8. So yeah, I think it's a very positive format right now.
Awesome. Well, that's going to wrap up today's tier list. Let us know what you think down below. Was there any archetype that we didn't discuss that you want us to touch on as well? Always happy to take you down in the comments and talk about anything. So we'll be back tomorrow for another video. Thanks for watching. Cheers.